my channel. It's your girl Patra Kiera, and today's video is going to be about some of my favorite fashion podcasts that I listen to on the go and that I think that you guys should definitely check out. So the first podcast that I want to talk to you guys about is The Cutting Room Floor, and this podcast is hosted by Rachel Omandi. If you guys are already not familiar with Rachel Omandi, she is a fashion designer, a brand consultant. She is very, very involved in the world of fashion, and she has been for at least like a decade or more now. And she used to have a ready-to-wear label called Omandi actually, but during the pandemic she decided to focus more on her podcast, which she said after just doing research she saw that a podcast was way more sustainable than a clothing brand and just producing more things and putting it out there with the problems that we already have with the environment. On the podcast, she interviews some highly knowledgeable people in the fashion industry in very niche markets, and they go really in depth on different fashion topics and just also fashion history as well. I've learned so much just from listening to this podcast. With her background in technical design, she's just able to ask a lot of questions that a lot of journalists wouldn't even know to ask. Her interviews include Heron Preston, Martine Rose, Mara Hoffman, I'm pretty sure Beth Ann Hardison as well, and that's just to name a few people. Right now, I don't think that she puts full episodes on Apple Podcasts and Spotify anymore. She used to in the past, so if you want to go back and listen to a lot of her episodes, they go all the way back to like 2018. But now she has a Patreon, which is I think like only $3 a month, so it's really not that much for the content that you're receiving. So if you are someone who is interested in learning about different job positions, or you might not know what you want to do, if you want to be a part of the fashion industry, check her out. Check this podcast out. The next podcast that I want to discuss is The Business of Hype with Jeff Staples, and this is another just like interview-based podcast, but it's so good. Like, Jeff Staples doesn't even make episodes anymore on this podcast, but I still go back and listen to some of the ones that I might have missed because I was listening to this podcast faithfully before the pandemic happened. This podcast was very crucial in just giving me a lot of knowledge on either fashion topics or people in the industry, or just also different job positions that I was not aware of at first. If you aren't familiar with Jeff Staples, he is the founder of Staple Design, which is a multifaceted communication agency in New York City. He also has a brand called Staple Pigeon, which is a menswear line, and he does a lot of collabs with different people. His most highly sought after collab is actually the Nike SB Pigeon Dunks, and when I was looking them up, they go for like $50,000 on StockX. But also StockX has ridiculous prices sometimes, so I don't know, but when I kept looking at different sources, it was giving me 5-digit numbers, and I was a little like, whoa. That just goes to tell you a little bit about the hype that Jeff Staples holds within the streetwear community, but his podcast is a whole nother beast by itself. He interviews a lot of creatives in the fashion industry, so if you are looking for a more creative position in the world of fashion and in streetwear or art, whatever it might be, then this is the podcast for you, because he not only interviews people in the fashion industry, it is also just like the art world and the luxury world and just all of that jazz put together in one. When Jeff conducts these interviews, he's definitely painting a picture so that you can kind of see the journey of the career paths that people have taken and what led them to get into the positions that they are now, which is really crucial because I know a lot of us struggle to figure out how to either reach certain people or reach certain heights within the industries that we're going for. So I definitely recommend checking out old episodes. Some of his interviews include Olivier Rousting, I hope I'm saying his name right, of Valmont. He has interviewed Joe Freshgoods. He's interviewed Jerry Lorenzo, which is an amazing interview actually. So you guys definitely have to check out The Business of Hype. It is available on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. The next podcast I'm going to discuss is called Dressed the history of fashion. This is one of my favorite podcasts just because like I'm really into vintage and really into like the world of resale. And this podcast goes like back centuries into just like the origins of clothes. Like they have an episode on the origin of jeans, they have an episode on the evolution of corsets, they have episodes on just about everything. This podcast is hosted by two fashion historians known as April Callahan and Cassidy Zachary, and they do a great job of really going in depth with the history of fashion. They do eras, they do specific clothing items. So if you're really into learning about the history of clothes, then I definitely recommend this podcast. There are over 300 episodes on topics including historical fashion figures, historical eras, important items, clothing garments, just different things that really shaped fashion and culture. They talk about American fashion. I mean, I could really go on and on, but I just want you guys to really look into this podcast because I feel like you will really enjoy it. And it's not boring. Like, it's not a boring fashion history podcast. They do a great job of explaining everything in a way that will keep the listener's attention. So this is a great podcast to just listen to if you're on the train or if you're in the car or wherever you might be headed to school. So they release new episodes every Tuesday and Thursday and can be found on iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. I'm pretty sure they're on other streaming platforms, but I know those are like the main ones that people normally check out. So yes, make sure to give it a listen. The last podcast I'm going to talk about is called The Conversations, and it's hosted by Henrietta, Gallina, and Jason Campbell. These two have been a part of the fashion industry for over a decade, probably longer than that, honestly. They've been around for a very, very long time, and I love this podcast because it's just a free-flowing conversation, i.e. the name of the podcast, The Conversations. The host of the podcast just basically talk about different fashion topics. And a lot of the episodes, they relate back to Black fashion and just the impact of Black culture in the fashion industry. They talk about performative activism. They touch on marketing ploys, for instance, the Kanye and Julia Fox situation, when that was a situation. No tea. This is a great podcast to listen to if you are into like current events in fashion, or if you just want to hear the perspectives of others who are well endowed and well placed in the fashion industry. I would definitely recommend listening to this podcast. All right, so that is the end of this video. If you have any fashion podcasts that you're currently listening to that you want to share, make sure to comment them down below so we can put one another on, because I would definitely love to know about other fashion podcasts that are out there that I'm not listening to. Also, hit me up on IG if you decide to listen to any of the podcasts that I mentioned and you have any perspectives or viewpoints on them, because like I said, I really enjoy all of these podcasts that I mentioned, and I feel like y'all will too, but I would definitely love to hear if you do. So yes, I will see you in my next video. Peace.